What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my own sort of personal wish list for Pathfinder games we might get in the future, and while I don't really expect any of these to happen, at the very least not soon, given how there are only 2 currently known Pathfinder games in development, and we'll talk about those momentarily, but as somebody who is well known for my love of Wrath of the Righteous, I thought it might be fun to just talk about some of the other adventure paths and things like that I think would be especially interesting to play through with some twists and everything. With that in mind, though, just a couple of notes here at the beginning. For starters, obviously there's not any actual footage of these things. I might throw up some art here and there, but for the most part, you're pretty well free to listen, as the bulk of this video is me just finding excuses to talk about Pathfinder. And to that end, let's set some things up here. So, generally speaking, what has happened thus far is that video games and things have been made of Pathfinder's adventure paths. These are effectively like a monthly magazine type thing that over the course of several issues makes up a complete adventure. Sometimes these are small, which is usually a 3-month thing, and then some of them are much bigger with a 6-month run. They are not the only things Pathfinder puts out. They do also put out more traditional modules, though the adventure paths are kind of the thing they're known for. For instance, Kingmaker and Wrath of the Righteous were each collectively an adventure path. And as I do love CRPGs like that, most of what I have in mind is that kind of thing. Now that said, it is very possible we'll get some games of varying genres eventually. There's at least one in development currently, which is Pathfinder Abomination Vaults. While Abomination Vaults was in fact an adventure path, this particular game is being developed into more of a Diablo-esque ARPG, which seems to be moving along pretty well in development. It was announced a while ago. They've recently done like play tests and stuff. Realistically, I don't think it will be that much longer before I start talking about that one personally. But the other one currently in development is Pathfinder The Dragon's Demand. This is going to be an interesting one because it follows a module rather than a full-blown adventure path, but it also is going to be utilizing minis and things as a full-blown CRPG though, so just obviously a bit of a different presentation style, likely down to, of course, a company with a different size. They had a successful Kickstarter for this one, genuinely looking forward to playing it, hope it turns out well. I do think the minis are going to put some people off at the very least, however. But that's what is currently being made. Let's talk about the ones I would like to see. Now, I do have some specific ideas here, and probably the one I want to start with being the most interesting in the sense that the way I would want it done isn't really the way it is presented in the adventure paths, because it's actually 2 that I would like kind of blended into a single game ideally. That is to say, Hell's Rebels and Hell's Vengeance. Both of these adventure paths actually happen concurrently, as you might have been able to tell by the name. So they both happen in the lawful evil nation of Cheliax. In Hell's Rebels, in response to some of the things happening as part of the Hell's Vengeance campaign, Cheliax tries to lock down the region known as, I believe it's Ravenel, and this was already a pretty rebellious area despite the lawful evil nature of the nation, and their response to effectively being massacred as they impose martial law here was to naturally form a rebellion, and that rebellion actually winds up being successful, at least canonically speaking, and then it leads to the formation of the nation of Ravenel, which has a complicated relationship with, of course, Cheliax afterwards. Now, while all that is ongoing, Hell's Vengeance is also happening at the same time. This is actually a rebellion of Iomedean paladins who seek to overthrow the nation of Cheliax as a whole from its, of course, evil oppressors who rule the place. Now, the catch here is, in Hell's Vengeance, you don't actually play as the Glorious Reclamation. You play as the bad guys who suppress that rebellion. Now, my idea for a game here would be to take the canonical outcome, kind of ignore it, and put the power in the hands of the player here. So much in the way that Kingmaker and Wrath of the Righteous definitely take a lot of liberties with the way that story actually plays out, you could definitely do the same thing here for the sake of making this an interesting game. For instance, weaving both of these rebellions more closely together, involving them with each other, and having you pick a side between, like the rulers of Cheliax or one of these rebellions. And in both instances, you'd be able to, of course, navigate the really interesting nation of Cheliax, its strict adherence to the very esoteric laws it chooses to abide by in service of the deity Asmodeus. And I think if they would be willing to, of course, combine and, again, take some liberties with how all of that plays out, I think you could collectively make a scenario that's probably much more interesting than the individual adventure paths, which are already pretty good. Now, do I think this will ever actually happen? Not at all. But it would nonetheless be very, very fun. Now, for this next one, I'm kind of interested in it just because of the novelty of what it tries to do, and this is actually one of the more recent adventure paths known as Outlaws of Alkenstar. So Outlaws of Alkenstar effectively puts you in the role of a band of outlaws trying to get their revenge on the person who, of course, wronged them. Now, this one is a little more like Wild West meets steampunk. And while it's a little shorter than the other ones, as this is just a 3-part adventure path, I think it has a lot of potential of being a really interesting and replayable experience, mostly because this is an adventure path that takes advantage of some of the more recent rules, like all of the guns and everything that were added with, I believe it was the Gears and Guns rulebook for 2E, and it just blends a lot of ideas that I think could really be fun in a way that you don't really see a lot of games trying to tackle, which is why it is of interest to me primarily. Keeping with the slightly newer adventure paths, though, another one I think would be really interesting is actually Gatewalkers, though. So Gatewalkers is another 2E adventure path that, in many ways, I would say is trying to evoke the feelings of the Cthulhu mythos in the vein of things like the Mountains of Madness. This is technically another 3-parter by default, but the catch is Gatewalkers puts you in the role of a group of heroes who were part of something that is called the Missing Moment. Basically, there was a global event where, people just vanished for a while. Some of them came back, and everyone who this happened to came back typically with some sort of occult power. This particular adventure path coincided with 2E's release of, I believe it was called the Dark Archive rulebook, which included all sorts of occult investigators, that type of stuff. So it sort of plays around with the idea of cosmic horror without ever stepping directly into it, which I think actually kind of fits the genre of horror pretty well. And because your characters are trying to find out exactly what happened to them during this moment, which is where their memory blanks, so it's not like total amnesia, there's just this very specific moment that they don't remember, which itself leads into the sort of paranormal investigation side of things, and it's actually a really interesting adventure path. I liked this one a lot, and I think it would do a really good job of delving into the concepts of the Cthulhu mythos without invoking it directly, because of the way it deals with the occult elements, and that is of interest to me at the very least, as I think a lot of stuff that does dive into that tends to go for a little too much on the one-to-one route, and it winds up being a little predictable as a result. And I think there is a potential here for it to not do that, basically. Coming in at number 4, we have, of course, a pretty well fan-requested one, admittedly, and that is Rise of the Runelords and its follow-up, Return of the Runelords. Now, this is an interesting one in the sense that it's an adventure path that technically kind of got a sequel. So Rise of the Runelords was the first adventure path they ever made, and now they're up to I think 41 published and 44 announced if you include the 3 that are upcoming. But Rise of the Runelords was the very first one, and it deals with 7 very, very powerful wizards who are known as Runelords because of their mastery of rune magic, which are typically each associated with one of the 7 deadly sins. In fact, if you've played Wrath of the Righteous, you can meet a former Runelord in the form of Alderpash as part of Baphomet's Labyrinth. But the Runelords were incredibly influential. They had a gigantic impact on everything they touched, and obviously these modules are no different. But the catch is, Rise of the Runelords is just the first one. Return of the Runelords happens later and brings in the rest of the Runelords, and sees you fighting some just really interesting situations as a result of that. And while I'm very much so up for Rise of the Runelords, I think the really interesting thing there would be to try to tie that at the same time to Return in some way. And then it's do you do both of those together? Because that would have to be a gigantic game, but you kind of don't want to do one without the other, at least in my opinion, so you kind of get the full arc there. So if someone were ever to do Rise of the Runelords, I would really, really like to have it be done with the intention of doing the follow-up as well, which is kind of why I don't expect that one to really ever happen. But I'd still be content with just Rise, I suppose. Now, last but not least, we have my number 1 Pathfinder game that I would love to see, and that is none other than the Bloodlords adventure path. Another 2nd edition adventure path. Bloodlords is a couple years old, but it's actually one of my favorites. I really like this adventure path, and a big reason for that is that it puts you in an unusual role, or at least it eventually puts you in an interesting role, which is that of a Bloodlord, the ruling class of the undead nation of Geb. So Geb, as I just mentioned, is an undead nation. It is ruled by a wizard king of the same name. But here in this nation, the living are actually the minority. So, every single kind of undead you can think of, all the way from mindless thralls to the more intelligent vampires, and anything and everything in between happens here. And while I would say this is an adventure path that does kind of lean more heavily into the evil side of things, it doesn't have to be. In fact, if you read through the adventure path, a decent chunk of it is actually trying to at least provide you options for people to roleplay either a living character who is navigating all of this stuff, or someone who is not inherently evil trying to deal with the threat of the undead, who in some cases very existence is considered an evil act. Which presents you with some interesting moral quandaries here, because, something like a lich, which is technically evil in this realm, is also kind of just a citizen of this nation, as an example. So this nation, which is ultimately a society of all of those people, or undead beings, collectively living together and being structured as an actual nation that you are going to be ruling in, and getting to the bottom of a bunch of potential threats, which can potentially even see you rousing Geb, the undead ruler, from his apathy that he has found himself, that allowed the conspiracy at the heart of this particular adventure path to fester. I think makes for a really great story that is quite a bit different than a lot of the other stuff they put out, thanks in large part to the very sort of alien nature of a nation like Geb. And I would love to see a game that tries to examine some of that stuff. I would really like to see Bloodlords, but that is pretty much going to do it for this particular video. Just thought I would share some of the Pathfinder games and adventure paths I would love to see adapted to video games, and what can only be described as a thinly veiled excuse to talk about Pathfinder. But hopefully you enjoyed all that. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know down below which kind of Pathfinder adventure paths or any other particular module or content you would love to see in the future, because while I honestly don't expect it to happen anytime soon at this point, it would nonetheless be very fun to see. But that is pretty much going to do it for this particular video. Certainly hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.